Hello all, my name is Randy Chambers. I am the director of the Keck Environmental Lab at William & Mary here in Williamsburg, Virginia. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about my all-time favorite turtle species, the Diamondback Terrapin. The terrapin is so named for the diamondback shapes on the back of its shell. It's a unique species in the United States. It's the only estuarine species of turtle that we have. It is found in salinities from 0 to 35 parts per thousand. It's not closely related to sea turtles. It's actually more closely related to freshwater turtles like painted turtles, pond sliders, river cooters, species like that. But it's interesting because its distribution is broad. It's found from the north shore of Cape Cod all the way down the Atlantic seaboard, around the peninsula of Florida, along the Gulf Coast, all the way to Texas. So broad distribution of the species. But interestingly, the individual populations tend to be located in very small areas. So the populations in Chesapeake Bay, for example, tend to have limited home ranges of a couple of kilometers. So a turtle that lives in a tidal creek tends to stay in that tidal creek its entire life. They don't go down to Florida during the wintertime. They stay in Chesapeake Bay. So they really are our turtles. And I'm going to share my screen and talk to you a little bit about terrapins. You probably all know that the state mascot or the mascot of the University of Maryland is the Diamondback Terrapin. It is the state reptile of Maryland. And there's terrapin ale, which is brewed in Athens, Georgia. The picture here is a picture of Diamondback Terrapin females that were in the back of a pickup truck. And these were not harvested by someone wanting to catch turtles for consumption. These were female turtles that had emerged from the Jamaica Bay estuary, which is in southern New York. Jamaica Bay turtles emerge during the nesting season to crawl up onto land to look for places to nest. Unfortunately, the place to nest next to Jamaica Bay is JFK Airport. So these terrapins were actually marching across the runways at JFK. They shut down the runways and then ran out onto the runways and harvested all the terrapins to take them back to Jamaica Bay so they wouldn't be crushed by airliners as they were taking off and landing. Terrapins are interesting in that they are sexually dimorphic. Females are much larger than males, and this has an evolutionary advantage in that females then can store more eggs or produce more eggs during an individual nesting season and over the course of her entire lifetime. So a greater opportunity for reproduction associated with larger females. Their habitat is coastal bays, lagoons, marshes, and tidal creeks. These are the places that you're typically going to find Diamondback terrapins. And you'll find them there because the things that they eat are located there. Snails, crabs, worms, barnacles, other invertebrates, fish, just about anything. These particular species are omnivores and will eat just about anything they can find. Their life cycle is that adults swim in tidal creeks. They feed in the marshes. They will also feed in subtidal seagrass beds. They hibernate or brumate, another term for hibernation, in subtidal muds, especially around here in the wintertime when it gets very cold. They go into reduced activity down in the mud. The females emerge during the nesting season to nest on open beaches and associated uplands. The nesting season for Diamondback terrapins around here in Chesapeake Bay just began at the end of May and will continue through the middle of July. Here I have a picture of a nest that I dug up after a female had nested, and there is a clutch of eggs here. The number of eggs per clutch varies from 3 to 15, let's say, and an individual female may nest once, twice, or maybe even 3 times during that nesting season from May through July. So this is a nest that I saw that had been laid, and I covered it back up again. And so the turtles would have an opportunity to incubate and then eventually hatch. Unfortunately, this is what often happens with Diamondback terrapin nests. They are predated. And this particular nest was predated probably by a raccoon. The nest was dug up, and then here we have the remnants of the shells of the eggs that have been eaten. So raccoons will eat Diamondback terrapins. They will also be eaten by other mammals such as opossums, coyotes, foxes. During the daytime, if a seagull or a crow sees a Diamondback terrapin nesting, they will wait until the female is finished nesting. When she leaves, the birds will come in and dig up the nest and consume the eggs. So there are a lot of threats to Diamondback terrapins at that egg stage. Here is a picture of Goodwin Islands, which is part of the Virginia National Estuarine Research Reserve. The dark blue dots are sites where we found predated nests in the islands, and there are lots of them. In fact, in this particular year, we found almost 1,000 predated nests. The light blue dots, in contrast, are successful nests, where the nest was laid and was not predated by mammals or birds. And the red dots are just other research locations. So there are more light blue dots at the eastern portion of the Goodwin Islands and more dark blue dots indicating more predation at the western end. This is where the raccoons live in this associated uplands, and we think that provides them easy access to Diamondback terrapins that are nesting in those particular areas. Terrapins as adults have very few predators, but one of them is the bald eagle. And here is a bald eagle nest with a couple of chicklets, and those little eagles have a veritable smorgasbord of things to eat. Here's a gizzard shad, here's a striped bass, and here a turtle, there a turtle, everywhere a turtle. Lots of Diamondback terrapins that have been brought to the nest for the chicks to eat. So this is an interesting source of predation. Eagles are doing really well right now in Chesapeake Bay, so this is an increasing source of mortality for adult Diamondback terrapins. Historically, humans were a source of mortality for terrapins. Terrapins, in fact, were raised in farms for consumption. They were harvested and then brought to market, and some of the best restaurants would serve Diamondback terrapin. It was considered a delicacy back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So much so that the terrapins were harvested to commercial extinction in the 1920s. And over the last 100 years, the terrapins have had an opportunity then to recover from those intense harvest pressures associated with humans. But there is a current harvesting pressure that's associated with humans, and it's an unintentional harvest, and it's the bycatch associated with the commercial crabbing industry. The commercial crab pot is put out on the bottom of Chesapeake Bay and in other estuarine locations, and Diamondback terrapins swim into the pots and become bycatch. And because terrapins are reptiles and need to surface to the air to breathe, these pots are underwater and they can't get access, and they drown. And they drown sometimes in large numbers. The figure to the left shows one derelict crab pot. This was a pot that was not being actively fished by anyone. It had broken away from its buoy or had been carried into a tidal creek during a coastal storm, and terrapins were able to crawl in and drown. And in this particular pot, there were over 90 dead turtles, 90 in a single pot. So we have these mass mortality events that occur. The stranding of dead turtles here on the right occurred in New Jersey and probably was associated with a waterman fishing crab pots. And then as dead turtles were encountered in the crab pots, the dead turtles were then thrown overboard, and then they drifted eventually into shore. So we've got these large mass mortality events that are associated with commercial crabbing, and then there is this background crabbing pressure that probably kills, a couple of turtles every once in a while, but there are a lot of commercial crab pots in Chesapeake Bay, somewhere on the order of 800,000 commercial crab pots that are fishing daily from March until November, and that imposes a potential for a lot of terrapin mortality. Here's a figure that shows the location of derelict commercial crab pots that were removed from the bottom of Chesapeake Bay. The Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences had a grant to fund watermen to go out during the wintertime, during the non-crabbing season, locate these derelict pots that are sitting on the bottom of Chesapeake Bay and remove them. So they did that for 3 years, and each year they removed about 10,000 pots. So 30,000 pots were removed in all of these locations. Each red dot is a pot. But unfortunately, this is a lot like removing litter along the highway. You get some kind-hearted souls to adopt the highway, and they go out and they remove all the trash, and everyone feels good. And then the very next day, there's a pile of trash out on the highway again. And there's this chronic trash being put on the highway, and there's this chronic increase in the number of derelict pots in the bottom of Chesapeake Bay every crabbing season. And the beat goes on and on and on. Diamondback terrapins prefer habitats that look like this. This is an aerial shot of a marsh creek system where there are lots of intertidal creeks and open water creeks and marshes. The terrapins can go out and feed in the marshes and then retreat to low tide locations in these tidal creeks. Females have open sandy beaches, which provide sites for nesting. So all the critical pieces of the habitat are in place in this particular shot, and they're close by. So this is a good site for diamondback terrapins to live. This, not so much. So this is a more developed estuarine environment, and there are lots and lots of people here. And the immediate things that you see is, yeah, okay, we've got some open water, but where is the marsh? There's really not much intertidal marsh left. Those marshes have probably been filled and developed to some extent. Bulkheads have been put in along the edges. Docks have been put in along the edges. So imagine you're a turtle and you're out here looking for marsh, can't find it. Let's say you're a female turtle and you're out here looking for a nesting site, trying to get into uplands, and you can't find it. Not only can't you find it, but you can't even get there because there are bulkheads put in place which have hardened the shoreline and make the shoreline inaccessible to an aquatic turtle out in the water. Finally, everyone that has a dock is given the right to put 2 commercial crab pots in the water per person living at that particular site. So lots of commercial crab pots in the water, and imagine you're a turtle running the gauntlet here along the edge of this tidal creek, and every single dock that you pass has at least 2 commercial crab pots in which you might drown. So this is a very difficult environment for terrapins to maintain themselves. So we know that the terrapin occupancy, its location in a particular habitat, is positively related to the proportion of marsh in the intertidal zone. So as long as there's marsh present within a 500-meter radius, you probably can expect to find diamondback terrapins. Terrapins need access to nesting beaches, and typically those nesting beaches have to be within 1 kilometer of that tidal creek where the terrapins occur. The females will swim 1 kilometer, maybe a little bit more, to locate potential nesting sites. Terrapin occupancy is negatively related to derelict crab pot density in open water, and you might expect that. If there are more derelict crab pots, there's more opportunity for mortality, and the overall population size is going to go down, or it may actually be removed entirely. And then finally, the presence of shoreline hardening restricts the access of female terrapins to nesting sites, and that is obviously going to limit the maintenance of a terrapin population. Okay, well, we wanted to look at how commercial crabbing operations might influence populations of diamondback terrapins. So we set out some commercial crab traps and put them in the water to see how many terrapins would get caught. But rather than catch terrapins and drown them, we cut the tops of the commercial crab traps open and then put chicken wire chimneys on top of them. And these chimneys then sit and rise above the water surface. So if a terrapin is caught below the surface in a commercial crab trap, it can swim up and then have access to air so that it will not drown. And here's a cute little river otter for scale to show you where these things are located. All right, so here is one of those traps, and you can see the chimney located up here. And here are a bunch of diamondback terrapins that were caught in this trap. There is a bait well in the middle of a commercial trap, and you'll note that this particular bait well has nothing in it. These traps were not baited. These were just put in the water, and the terrapins are inquisitive, and they swim into these traps without even having the presence of bait in the trap. And so this is a potential really important issue for diamondback terrapins, that they will swim into these things even without bait. So we wanted to look at whether we could include bycatch reduction devices on commercial crab traps to try to reduce the overall bycatch of diamondback terrapins. You know, the goal obviously is going to be to reduce the bycatch of these while maintaining the harvest of the blue crab. The bycatch reduction devices are simple, hard plastic devices that are placed in the funnel openings of the commercial crab trap. And if a terrapin has a high shell, it can't fit its way into the trap. So that is the way that we exclude terrapins, is by the height of the shell. So there is a physical exclusion mechanism for keeping the terrapins out of the crab traps, just by narrowing the funnel opening. But now the question is, does the narrow funnel opening affect crab behavior? So we completed video recordings of crabs entering and leaving pots with and without bycatch reduction devices to see whether or not crabs were influenced, in addition to looking at how terrapins might be influenced. And so now I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to go to, what am I going to do? I'm going to share my screen again and go to another screen and see how this works. So here is a swimming pool with a commercial crab trap in it, and we just recorded how terrapins respond to a commercial crab trap. So this is just a short little recording looking at how terrapins respond to commercial crab traps. And here's a terrapin swimming along. There's the funnel opening, and the terrapin swims right into the trap. It doesn't even hesitate. It just goes right in. This is an unbaited commercial crab trap. So this is a real problem for Diamondback terrapins, that these traps are down on the bottom, right at the level at which terrapins are cruising along the bottom. Here's another one, and it's coming into the trap, and it sees the funnel opening, and in it goes. So, you know, this is something that really is problematic, that terrapins have a behavior that they are being inquisitive, going into pots, and then they're getting stuck in these commercial crab traps. Okay, now I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to share a screen again and go back to where we were, and see if we can continue here. All right, so then we looked at how many crabs are entering these pots versus pots without bycatch reduction devices versus pots with bycatch reduction devices. And lo and behold, more crabs are going into pots without the bycatch reduction device. With the BRD, fewer crabs are going into the pots. So there actually is a decrease in the total number of crabs that are moving into pots with a BRD. That's not such a good thing. But now look at the average time that's spent in these traps once a crab goes into a pot. If a pot doesn't have a bycatch reduction device, a crab spends on average about 1.5 hours before finding its way back out again through the funnel opening. So it's a temporary capture of the crab. With the BRD, however, a crab goes into the pot with a BRD, and it stays in the pot for about 8 hours before it figures its way back out again. So there's a traffic flow issue that's going on here. Yes, fewer crabs get into a pot with a BRD, but yes, crabs spend far longer in a pot with a BRD, so that the chance that the waterman is going to capture this crab is increased because of that. Okay, so how does this play out? What's the net effect of a bycatch reduction device on a pot, on pots with and without BRDs? Crab catch, on average in pots without BRDs, was 2.2 legal crabs per night. Red BRDs, pots with BRDs that were colored red, had 2.3 crabs per night. The crab size was 14 centimeters across the carapace versus 13.8 centimeters across the carapace, not significantly different. The sex ratio was 40-to-1 males to females in pots without BRDs, and 145-to-1 in pots with red BRDs. It seems like the male crabs are attracted to the color red, which is an interesting effect that we found. And then finally, terrapin bycatch in pots with BRDs. Lots of terrapins caught in pots with BRDs, very few without BRDs, and very few terrapins caught in pots with BRDs. So overall, a good effect of BRDs, and one that we feel pretty good about. But now we have this issue. Can bycatch reduction devices successfully address the bycatch issue? And in Virginia, the answer is probably no. Currently, there are BRD regulations in New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. The blue crab fishery regulations in Virginia are determined by the Virginia Marine Resources Commission. To consider bycatch reduction devices, VMRC requires evidence from Virginia waters that terrapin populations are of a concern. Check. Commercial and recreational crabbing can drown terrapins. Check, check, check. BRDs may reduce bycatch without affecting crab catch. It seems like there are instances where that actually happens. But then here are the ones that are difficult to check. BRD use will be economically feasible for commercial crabbers. No one has demonstrated that yet. BRD compliance and enforcement will be effective. I really have concerns about this actually happening at all. The BRDs that are required in Maryland, the enforcement is non-existent, and the compliance has been estimated to be about 30%. So 30 out of 100 people who are required to have BRDs in their pots are actually using them. And then finally, BRD use will conserve some terrapin populations and restore others. These regulations have not been in place long enough to determine whether their use is going to conserve terrapins in some areas or actually restore populations in others. So the jury is still out on whether this will actually happen. But finally, back to the terrapins themselves, what is the impact of 75, 80 years worth of commercial crabbing that has happened in Chesapeake Bay? Well, we've got some big turtles now in Chesapeake Bay. In fact, the terrapins now are larger from Chesapeake Bay than they were 100 years ago. And we know this from museum specimens, that for a given age of turtle, they were much smaller 100 years ago than they are now when we have the widespread use of commercial crab traps. And why is that? I mean, it's a different environment. We've got far more people around Chesapeake Bay in the watershed, a lot of people using the bay. Are there different food resources out in the bay that they're getting bigger now than they did 100 years ago? Well, we think what's happened is that the selective removal of smaller terrapins that fit into commercial crab traps through that funnel is selecting against the small terrapins and selecting for large terrapins. If you are a large female terrapin and you grow very fast, then you actually grow large enough to not fit in a commercial crab trap. And if that's the case, then you survive, and you survive to reproduce, and then your turtle hatchlings will probably have acquired the genetic disposition to grow fast and grow larger. So that selective pressure of commercial crabbing has probably led to increased sizes of females in Chesapeake Bay. So what's the future of terrapins in Chesapeake Bay? Well, we're not really sure. There are certainly a lot of people interested in terrapin conservation. There are a lot of people who are interested in trying to figure out better ways to harvest crabs without impacting the diamondback terrapin populations. So what remains to be seen, more research continues in these particular areas, and we hope that things will go on. So that's the story here with respect to diamondback terrapins. Note that the National Estuarine Research Reserve in Virginia has terrapin populations at Goodwin Islands, at Catlet Islands, and also at the York River State Park marshes. So they are found out in Chesapeake Bay, found in the York River estuary of Chesapeake Bay, and we're doing our Yankee Doodle list to promote diamondback terrapin conservation in Virginia and in Chesapeake Bay. That's it. Thanks very much, and keep terrapining.